Hi, everyone. Welcome back to all my listeners. This is episode number 9 of season 9. Today is Wednesday, June 28th, 2023. My name is Sonal Patel, and this is the Paint the Medical Picture podcast series. Now, all right, you guys, I hope you guys are doing all right. The month of June is just 2 days away from closing down. But anyway, you guys, hope you guys are enjoying it and taking every moment into consideration because time flies by so fast. Now, all right, you guys, I hope you remember to please go ahead and start following me on Spotify as well, because a couple months ago, Anchor became Spotify for podcasters. So Spotify is yet another platform where you can find my Paint the Medical Picture podcast. So I can't wait to see all of you following me on Spotify as well as that fabulous Apple Podcasts and Amazon Music. And this podcast is simply everywhere. So there's just one more platform for you to find me on. And don't forget about my YouTube channel as well. All right, you guys. Now let's get into today's episode, right? It is the last Wednesday of the month. And you do know by now in these 2 years that it's my very favorite, the Newsworthy fraud, waste, and abuse highlights for the month of June. And of course, I'm going to be spotlighting some of those from the month's criminal and civil enforcement cases that I find newsworthy. And all right, you guys, of course, in my compliance tips and my compliance recommendations in Trusty Tip, I wanted to dive into the latest, the 6th CBR for the year on lower endoscopy. And I'm going to go ahead and close out today's episode with a remarkable quote on success by Truman Capote. If you guys have checked me out on LinkedIn, you know I'm all about compliance and protecting our physicians and our valued healthcare professionals when it comes to the business of medicine. I hope this week with me brings you enough to take back to your organizations, to want to dive in deeper, to use my tips and best practices to ensure success. I hope this podcast will help you boost the quality of documentation capture and improve your coding accuracy as you help all your providers paint the medical picture. If you like what you're hearing, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button now so you don't miss another episode. Please write in a review and kindly drop me a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, and definitely start following this podcast on Spotify. I'd really love your support on Spotify as well. And as always, a friendly disclaimer. Remember, I'm bringing you the news, current healthcare industry news, my compliance tips and my compliance recommendations based on my over 12 years of experience in front office, in back end, in coding, and in billing for multi-specialty physicians, in compliance, and in auditing for both E&M and surgical operative reports. These are my opinions alone and are not to be construed as legal advice. Today's episode is sponsored by Advanced Coding Services, a leading medical billing and medical coding school in the United States. Whether you're just starting out or a seasoned professional, our training equips you with the tools and support you need to advance your career. Our medical billing and coding school meets your needs worldwide online or in person with one-on-one support throughout your training. We are committed to helping our alumni and credentialed medical community in keeping up their certifications by offering various avenues for acquiring your continuing education units. In addition to our Mastering the Business of Medicine retreats offered several times throughout the year in different parts of the country, we now offer memberships. You can conveniently earn your CEUs by attending our exclusive members-only webinars. Since our aim is to nurture and grow the careers of individuals who work in the business of medicine, we call our member area the Apple Orchard. Advanced Coding Services, educate, nurture, inspire, reaching back with a hand up. So let's get into Newsworthy, the month's fraud, waste, and abuse cases. The month of June saw 32 cases as of the recording of this episode. Early June saw a physician sentenced for stealing approximately $250,000 from COVID-19 relief programs. The physician was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison for fraudulently obtaining and misappropriating approximately $250,000 from 2 separate COVID-19 relief programs. According to court documents, he was the supervisory physician at a medical clinic with 3 other offices in the state. From March through June of 2020, he applied for and received government funds for COVID-19 relief from the Accelerated and Advanced Payment Program, as well as the Paycheck Protection Program. Both programs were designed to provide emergency financial assistance to medical providers and small businesses who were suffering economic effects from the COVID-19 pandemic. In total, he received approximately $250,000 from these programs and used the money to pay for his personal expenses. Early June also saw a pharmacist sentenced for $1 million in prescription drug fraud schemes. This pharmacist was sentenced to 2 years in prison for his role in a scheme to defraud Medicare of over $1 million in prescription drug benefits. According to court documents, he was the pharmacist in charge at a pharmacy located in Florida. Through this pharmacy, he and his co-conspirators billed Medicare for expensive compound drug creams that they never actually purchased or dispensed, instead providing Medicare patients an inexpensive compound drug cream that Medicare did not cover. In fact, the pharmacy did not buy enough of the expensive prescription drugs to fill all of the prescriptions this pharmacy billed to Medicare. In total, he and his co-conspirators received more than $1 million in fraudulent Medicare proceeds. Early June also saw a man sentenced in a $134 million COVID-19 healthcare fraud and money laundering scheme. This man was sentenced to 15 years in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release, and ordered to pay just shy of $30 million in restitution for conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud and money laundering. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud and money laundering back in 2022. According to court documents, he and his co-conspirators submitted more than $134 million in false and fraudulent claims to Medicare in connection with diagnostic laboratory testing, including urine drug testing and tests for respiratory illnesses during the COVID-19 pandemic that were medically unnecessary, not ordered by medical providers, and not provided as represented. He and his co-conspirators obtained medical information and private personal information for Medicare patients and then misused that confidential information to repeatedly submit claims to Medicare for diagnostic tests. According to court documents, he and his co-conspirators received more than $38 million from Medicare on those fraudulent claims. Mid-June saw a federal jury finding a physician assistant guilty of $10 million worth of a fraud scheme. The guilty verdict was returned against a physician assistant for his role in a genetic testing scheme that resulted in the submission of more than $10 million in fraudulent claims to the Medicare program. He was convicted of 1 count of healthcare fraud and 6 counts of making false statements relating to healthcare matters. According to the trial and evidence, witness testimony, and documents filed with the court in 2018 and 2019, he was a physician assistant who worked as an independent contractor for a physician staffing and telemedicine company. As trial evidence established, during the relevant time frame, he signed fraudulent prescriptions for medically unnecessary genetic testing, specifically cancer, genomic, and pharmacogenetic testing for hundreds of Medicare patients residing in the state. This PA had never met, seen, nor treated the patients and only had brief telephonic conversations with them or no interactions at all. Trial evidence showed that he received from a telemedicine company and its clients pre-populated prescription forms and related records for patients who were pre-selected for genetic testing, which he then electronically signed and returned in exchange for $12 and later $15 for each purported consultation that he performed. And according to the evidence presented at trial, he falsified medical records in connection with the unnecessary prescriptions, and he falsely certified that these genetic tests were medically necessary. The government's evidence established that his scheme resulted in the submission of more than $10 million in fraudulent reimbursement claims to Medicare and more than $3.6 million in payments. This physician assistant was released on bond, and a sentencing date has not yet been set. The healthcare fraud charges carry a maximum prison term of 10 years and a $250,000 fine. The charge of making false statements relating to healthcare matters carries a maximum penalty of 5 years in prison and a $250,000 fine per count. Mid-June also saw a former Alaska advanced nurse practitioner sentenced to 30 years for illegally prescribing millions of opioids, causing 5 deaths. She was sentenced to imprisonment for illegally prescribing and dispensing opioids outside the scope of legitimate medical practice that resulted in the deaths of 5 people between the years 2014 and 2019. Evidence presented during trial showed that she prescribed and dispensed 4.5 million dosages of opioids in just over 5 years, including fentanyl, methadone, oxycodone, and hydromorphone. Many times she combined those prescriptions with prescriptions for other dangerous drugs like Valium and muscle relaxers known as the Holy Trinity, greatly increasing the chances of overdose death. She wrote these prescriptions with little to no medical justification or treatment plan, minimal, if any, tests or physical exams, and little, if any, considerations of non-opioid treatments. Many of her patients were vulnerable and suffering from chronic pain, addiction, and mental illness, yet she disregarded their medical histories, risk factors, past overdoses, symptoms, and pleas to reduce or taper their doses. She also ignored warnings from patients' family members, pharmacists, and other medical providers, and defied thousands of warning letters sent by insurance companies about the dangers of her practices. An assistant U.S. attorney on the case stated, quote, "This is the deadliest drug case in this district's history. And disturbingly, the 5 deaths the defendant was convicted of at trial are just the tip of the iceberg," end quote, because, quote, "she may have caused or contributed to the deaths of dozens, 20 total confirmed drug overdoses, and many others suspected. She was a serial killer with a poison pen," end quote. He goes on and states, quote, "Her conduct was far more insidious," end quote, "than that of a street-level dealer," quote, "because she sanctioned and supplied lethal levels of drugs for her patients day after day, year after year, under the shroud of a prescribing license, assuring them that it was safe and necessary. In the process, she abused her authority and violated her oath as a medical professional, prescribing higher doses per patient than any other prescriber in the state during the charging period," end quote. Mid-June also saw a lab billing company settling False Claims Act allegations relating to unnecessary respiratory panels run on seniors receiving COVID-19 tests. This billing company for a diagnostics laboratory has agreed to pay over $300,000 to resolve False Claim Act allegations that it caused the submission of false claims to Medicare for medically unnecessary respiratory pathogen panels run on seniors who received COVID-19 tests. For one chain of senior living communities, a diagnostics laboratory directed this medical billing company to bill Medicare for respiratory pathogen panels purportedly ordered by a physician who had not actually ordered these tests and who was ineligible to treat Medicare patients. The billing company found the credentials of a different physician and, without authorization, billed Medicare using that physician's name. Medicare subsequently paid the laboratory for these medically unnecessary tests. The billing company received a credit in connection with the settlement in recognition of their cooperation. including by performing and disclosing the results of an internal investigation, disclosing relevant facts and material not known to the government but relevant to its investigation, providing information relevant to potential misconduct by other individuals and entities, and admitting liability. There were many, many of the other usual suspects as well, from DME fraud, telemedicine schemes, laboratory schemes, more opioids and oxycodone cases, and more kickbacks and bribery schemes. But I wanted to pay particular attention to a rather disturbing case where an ENT doctor was sentenced to 300 months in prison for adulterating surgical devices used in more than 1,400 nasal surgeries performed on Medicare patients between the years 2011 and 2018. She was also ordered to serve 3 years of supervised release and ordered to forfeit $4.7 million. In January of this year, she was found guilty by a federal jury on 20 criminal counts, including device adulteration, fraud, conspiracy, and identity theft. Evidence presented at trial demonstrated that she was an ear, nose, and throat doctor who operated in multiple offices in the state. She marketed balloon sinuplasty, which is an in-office procedure to treat chronic sinusitis, as a sinus spa, and she encouraged patients to come to the office for a free sinus spa, which was a treatment that they may not have needed. She falsified medical records to justify the billing of balloon sinuplasty surgeries to Medicare auditors. Between 2011 and the end of 2017, she performed 1,555 balloon sinuplasty surgeries on 919 Medicare patients, using the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA-approved Entellus Express device. However, instead of using this device only once and only on one patient as required by FDA guidelines, she reused those devices on multiple patients. Between 2012 and 2017, she obtained at most 36 brand new Entellus devices, despite being, at times, the top paid Medicare provider of balloon sinuplasty services in the country and providing more than 1,500 surgeries. In addition, she failed to inform her patients that they were receiving a procedure with an adulterated device. During trial, she admitted that she had sufficient money to buy every single patient a new device, but chose not to do so. She billed Medicare more than $46 million for the balloon sinuplasty procedures between 2014 and 2018. In that time, she netted more than $4.79 million from Medicare for these surgeries. That amount does not include any sinuplasty surgeries performed on patients with private health care insurance. And now it's time for my best practice tips in Trusty Tip. So in today's compliance tip, let's get into focus on the latest comparative billing report on lower endoscopy. This is CBR number 202306. That's right, this is the 6th CBR for the year for 2023. Right now, as I'm recording this episode at the end of June, CMS is going to be issuing a comparative billing report, a CBR, to rendering providers that submitted claims to Medicare Part B for lower endoscopy services. Now, this CBR number 202306 focuses on Medicare Part B claims submitted with current procedural terminology. Those are our CPT codes within the range of 45300 through 45398. Now, this analysis was based on the claims extracted from the Integrated Data Repository using the latest version of claims available on May 23, 2023. This analysis includes paid claims with dates of service from February 1st, 2022 through January 31st, 2023. The 2022 Medicare Fee-for-Service Supplemental Improper Payment Data Report reflects an improper payment rate of 2% for endoscopy, which represents over $14,600,000 in improper payments. After review of and research into the improper payment rate, this CBR was created to analyze the possible threat to the Medicare Trust Fund associated with lower endoscopy services. Now, the expectation is that rendering and referring providers for lower endoscopy services will maintain proper coding documentation procedures and confirm the appropriate use of CPT codes. Now, the criteria for receiving a CBR are that a provider is, number one, significantly higher compared to either the state or the national percentages in the metric calculations, which means greater than or equal to the 90th percentile. And number two, if that provider has had at least 16 patients with claims for lower endoscopy procedures. And finally, third, if that provider has had at least $3,700 in total allowed charges for lower endoscopy procedures. So let's get into the CPT codes that are in the spotlight here for this particular CBR. So those are the CPT codes 45300 through 45398 for endoscopy, sigmoidoscopy, colonoscopy, and laparoscopy. But specifically, the CBR addresses CPT code 45378, which is for colonoscopy, flexible, diagnostic, including collection of specimens by brushing or washing when performed, separate procedure. And this particular CBR also hones in on CPT code 45380, which is defined as colonoscopy, flexible, with biopsy, single or multiple. Now, the metrics involved here for this report is an analysis of three metrics. Number one, the percentage of lower endoscopy procedure claims submitted with CPT code 45378. And number two, the percentage of lower endoscopy procedure claims submitted with CPT code 45380. And finally, the third metric is for the total allowed amount of CPT code 45380. So the CBR analysis focuses on our rendering providers with the specific specialties of number 10, which is for our gastroenterologists. Specialty number 02, which is for our general surgeons. Specialty number 49, which is for ambulatory surgery center. Our specialty number 11 for our internal med physicians. Specialty number 28 for colorectal surgery, which was once known as proctology. These specific specialties that submitted claims for lower endoscopy procedures using CPT codes 45300 through CPT code 45398. Now, the statistics were calculated for each provider, all providers in the state, and all providers in the nation. Now, there were 25,012 rendering providers nationwide that submitted Medicare Part B claims for lower endoscopy procedures with combined allowed charges that were over $976 million. Remember, the lower endoscopy services vulnerability exists. And according to that 2022 Medicare fee-for-service supplemental improper payment data report, an improper payment rate of 2% for lower endoscopy services represents over $14,600,000 in improper payments. Now, be mindful, though, this particular CBR provides absolutely no further details on the percent of incorrect coding or insufficient documentation or the lack of medical necessity. Nothing. This particular CBR does not provide those details. But be mindful, of course, the desired behavior here for lower endoscopy services is, of course, number one, to protect the Medicare Trust Fund. Number two, to increase our providers' awareness about potential improper payments for lower endoscopy services. Number three, to support providers' internal compliance processes. And number four is, of course, to encourage self-audits for compliance. Now, it's critical to understand that this CBR does not indicate that you're going to get an official audit. Although please be mindful, I've said this time and time again on my podcasts for the past 2 years that address CBRs, because that phrase is coming directly from the MACs that issue the CBR, right? So take that with plenty of grains of salt. More directly, I do believe, in my opinion, that you are being looked at closely. This is a pretty good warning, a notice to you to start looking at your claims data. look under the hood and see what's going on with your endoscopy services. Now, the value of this CBR to providers is that it does serve as a tool to look at your billing patterns as compared to your peers in your state as well as across the country. Now, the value also includes the facts that specific coding guidelines and billing information will be detailed. Now, the CBR informs providers whose billing patterns differ from those of their peers. My best practice recommendations always include to review those CPT codes and definitions, which I just provided to you. It is not found in the CBR. I gave you those 2 CPT code definitions from our CPT code books. So be mindful and perform your regular internal reviews of documentation and code selection to ensure accuracy and compliance, because these 2 steps alone can definitely help reduce the possibility of improper payments. Remember, again, we have no details on how much is attributed to insufficient documentation, and there's no information on anything if it's due to incorrect coding. So be mindful about documentation as well as coding choices, right? Make sure that you are remaining compliant to both. So this particular CBR should have all of us providing lower endoscopy services really buckle down and self-audit whether we receive this CBR in the mail or not. Now's a great time to dive deeper into your own data, help yourself, and help the Medicare Trust Fund at the same time. You should be paying attention to what you are sending out the door. Is it really in compliance? So stay ahead of the curve and avoid receiving post-payment audits from the payers down the road. It's fundamental if you have Medicare as a payer to keep your eye on correct and compliant coding and billing practices and make sure that you are adhering to all of them. A better, smarter approach is one that's proactive and starts by painting a clear, rich, and vibrant medical picture the first time, so your certified medical coder can then abstract codes with accuracy. And finally, I focus Season 9 Spark on success. I want this 9th season Spark to be filled with our world's thought leaders, writers, artists, philosophers, everyone who inspires the need for success in all we strive to do. So, in this week's inspiring quote in Spark is from Truman Capote. Failure is the condiment that gives success its flavor. Wow, absolutely true, right? I think this is an amazing quote that reminds us that failure is not a bad thing. This quote reminds us that each failure or misstep helps shape us, mold us, be part of our success. I think this quote inspires us to keep on going despite the stumble. I think this quote reminds us that life will throw us curveballs. We should remember that no one just becomes successful overnight without any topsy-turvy moments. Our paths to success are lined with so much that is not, that was not, perfect. I'm happy Truman Capote's spark still burns brightly in all of us today. So that wraps up today's episode. And as always, I appreciate you all diving into today with me. If you want more information from me, please go ahead and follow me on LinkedIn. I'll leave links to everything in the show notes below. All right, you guys. So in my final note today, I hope you're all still staying motivated and positive for all of your personal and professional lives. June is simply wrapping up, right? It's just 2 days away and June is going to be done and we're going to be heading into July. So make time for your summer spirits to soar. Get on out there, find some sunshine for your next chapter. I know I am. Stick to those sunnier mindsets for these next few months and keep your mental health in check. All right, you guys, I wish you all an amazing and very happy week ahead. Thank you so much for listening in on today's episode. And I hope every week with me brings you closer to helping your providers paint a masterpiece. See you next Wednesday.